the late 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire, then ruled by the Stoic philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, faced one of its greatest threats. Not from the east, but from the wild northern frontier. Between 166 and 180 AD, barbarian tribes in enormous numbers swept across the Danube frontier, launching a massive invasion into Roman territory. This brutal and chaotic period became known as the Marcomannic Wars. It began when the Marcomanni, a powerful Germanic tribe, and their allies, the Quadi, and the fierce Sarmatian horsemen from the steppes of Eastern Europe, crossed into the Roman provinces of Noricum and Pannonia. They weren't alone. Wave after wave of barbarian peoples joined the assault. Pushed southward by pressures from other migrating groups, the frontiers of Germania erupted. It was an early echo of what would later be called the Migration Period, a time of great upheaval and movement among the peoples beyond Rome's borders. The Romans were completely caught off guard. Their eastern armies were already tied up in a devastating war against Parthia, and worse, a plague, likely smallpox, was sweeping through the empire, draining manpower and morale. Into this chaos surged the barbarian hordes, and they came in staggering numbers. Entire villages and communities flooded into Roman land. Not just warriors, but families, animals, and wagons. Overwhelming border defenses. The invaders didn't come in peace. Towns were pillaged, Roman citizens massacred, and settlements razed. In response, Marcus Aurelius gathered what forces he could and personally led the counteroffensive. The war dragged on for years, extremely grim, bloody, and exhausting. Roman legions burned Germanic villages to the ground and slaughtered civilians without mercy. The campaign was a war of attrition. The forests of Germania and the cold of the Danubian winters claimed thousands of Roman lives. Yet even under such darkness, the Romans adapted. They fortified their frontier, built roads, and learned to fight in the forests and marshlands. Marcus Aurelius, though a man of reason and reflection, ordered ruthless campaigns. Entire tribes were displaced. Thousands of captives were sold into slavery or forcibly settled in depopulated Roman provinces to repopulate the land and serve Rome. Alongside him was his teenage son Commodus, watching and learning. But where Marcus was disciplined and stoic, Commodus was theatrical and impatient. When Marcus died in 180 AD, possibly in one of the military camps on the frontier, Commodus abruptly ended the war. He signed a hasty peace and returned to Rome to embrace the luxury of the imperial court, later to be known as the Gladiator Emperor, abandoning his father's long-term goals of fully subduing the northern tribes. The peace was shallow. Many Romans resented the emperor's decision, believing it squandered the years of bloodshed and sacrifice. Marcus had dreamed of new provinces beyond the Danube, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, but those dreams died with him. Though the Marcomannic Wars ended on paper, the wounds they left on the empire were deep. They exposed the vulnerability of Rome's borders and foreshadowed the greater waves of barbarian invasions that would come centuries later. In the end, the Marcomannic Wars were not just a clash of armies, but of worlds, between the structured urban Roman civilization and the raw, tribal power of the northern frontier. It was a glimpse of Rome's future struggles and the beginning of the slow unraveling that would come to define the empire's twilight years. Following the uneasy peace that Commodus imposed, the true brutality of the Marcomannic Wars had only just been glimpsed. The conflict itself was far from a simple border skirmish. It was a grueling series of battles and sieges, fought deep in the dense forests and rugged terrain of the Danube frontier, where Roman discipline clashed against the fierce independence of the northern tribes. Among the primary barbarian groups were the Marcomanni, a powerful Germanic people whose name literally means men of the borderlands. Known for their skill in guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics, the Marcomanni were formidable opponents. Their warriors fought with a savage determination to protect their homeland from Roman conquest. Alongside them were the Quadi, another Germanic tribe inhabiting the lands just north of the Danube. The Quadi were fierce horsemen and archers, skilled at hit-and-run attacks that frustrated the slower Roman legions. Then came the Sarmatians, a nomadic people originating from the steppes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Unlike the Germanic tribes, the Sarmatians specialized in cavalry warfare, riding heavy armored horses and wielding long lances and swords. Their sudden charges could break Roman formations, forcing Marcus Aurelius' armies to adapt tactics or suffer devastating losses. The dynamics between these tribes were complex. While historically often rivals, during the Marcomannic Wars they formed uneasy alliances, united by a shared resistance to Roman imperialism. Their combined forces presented a terrifying front, and in enormous numbers, as whole populations moved, fueled by pressures of the broader migration period, when tribes and peoples across Europe and Asia were on the move. The fighting was brutal and merciless. Roman historians and contemporary accounts describe scorched earth tactics on both sides. The Romans, desperate to suppress the invasion, often responded to guerrilla attacks by razing entire villages in Germania, killing civilians, and destroying crops to starve out the enemy. These acts, while effective militarily, earned the empire a reputation for cruelty among the barbarians. The terrain itself was a relentless adversary. Dense forests, marshlands, and the bitter winters along the Danube took a heavy toll on the Roman legions, unaccustomed to such conditions. Disease, exhaustion, and supply shortages plagued the campaign. Despite this, Marcus Aurelius remained steadfast. His writings show a man burdened by the horrors of war, but resolute in his duty to defend the empire. Battles were fought not just with swords and spears, but also with psychological warfare. The Romans employed engineering ingenuity to build forts and roads deep into hostile territory, trying to sever barbarian supply lines and force them into pitched battles where Roman discipline and heavy infantry could dominate. However, the barbarians adapted as well. Their familiarity with the land allowed them to strike swiftly and vanish into the wilderness. The long wars stretched Rome's resources thin, forcing Marcus Aurelius to rely on a mix of veteran legions and newly recruited auxiliaries, including some barbarian tribes that had been pacified or co-opted. Commodus, who had spent much of the campaign as a young observer, eventually took command after his father's death. His approach contrasted sharply with Marcus Aurelius's stoicism. Commodus favored flashy displays and quick decisions over the long grind of warfare. His hasty peace treaty effectively ended the hostilities, but at a cost. It left many tribes unpacified and the Danube frontier volatile. The aftermath of the wars shaped the empire's fate. The Marcomanni and their allies remained a persistent threat. Rome's frontier defenses had been severely tested, and the barbarian incursions foreshadowed the greater waves of migration and invasion that would engulf the empire centuries later. In sum, the Marcomannic Wars were a clash of two very different worlds, a desperate struggle for survival, identity, and power on the fringes of one of history's greatest empires. The fierce tribal coalitions, the brutal combat, and the unrelenting hardships endured by both Romans and barbarians tell a story not only of war, but of the profound transformations sweeping across Europe during this turbulent era.